Hey there, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the Little Orthodox Max Kolbe Escaping Atheism Project. Hi, as usual, I'm your host, Max Kolbe. Please remember to give us a like. Please remember to give us a subscribe. Please check us out on escapingatheism.com. We're even looking now into accepting donations through Bitcoin, so watch for that. And tonight, we've brought on, you all may remember that I've had a couple of hangouts. Somebody made a mistake, and that was me. Sorry. Did everybody hear that? That was a weird noise.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, that was an echo. Anyway, Todd Lewis and I had done a hangout or two, including where we did a review of the Red Pill movie that I was in. Tonight, we're going to be talking with Mike, Todd's father, over a subject that I frequently just shy away from because I literally don't like the topic at all as a Christian myself. And I'm just giving my personal view, right? This isn't any church teaching. This isn't speaking for anybody at all but me. I didn't have a real good religious upbringing, and I was very much an agnostic or an atheist until I was in my 40s. I'm in my 50s now. So I was pretty much a child of the 1970s and the 1980s. And my memory of the issue of creationism or creation science from an early age, and again, I'll stress that my religious upbringing wasn't that strong to begin with, but I did have some. When we first heard about the this creation science stuff, my dad, who was an old school King James Bible man, reformed alcoholic, tried to live a good Christian life as best he understood through that. Even he said, I don't understand why these guys are trying to read that book so literally. I mean, that was my dad, right? And he was the last thing from what you'd call a theological liberal, and this was in the 70s. And personally, whenever I saw creationists trying to make a case, even as a child, I said, wow, it looks like these guys are working really hard to force the evidence to fit their conclusions. And I found it, from childhood, I'm just being honest, I just didn't find it compelling. And in some ways, it made me think the Christians were a little loopy. And then I would see them debate atheists. And to be honest, the atheists were so stupid that the creationists would usually win. And I would just want to run screaming out of the room because I didn't relate to any of it. And so it was very alien to me. And even when I came back to Christianity in a real and serious way, found Christ in a real and serious way, I never related to it. Over the years, on the other hand, and I'll finish wrapping up soon. Over the years, on the other hand, while I was an atheist, I was never one of these angry, hostile, hate you atheists that are so common today. Never at all. I mean, I disliked some Christians, but I just always knew that meant I disliked some Christians. I never would be rude to people, and I often had friends, including a friend of mine who was a diehard creationist, and he would always try and convert me to Christ and make me believe in God, and he would start with texts on creation science. And I was like, I couldn't believe he kept pushing this at me because it never convinced me. And so now it's like, when I watch these people debating it all the time, it gives me a headache because it's like I don't hate the creationists. In fact, the friend I just mentioned is a quite successful and brilliant computer programmer, right? So he was no idiot. I never found it even a little bit attractive or convincing. And it bothers me that as a Christian, I'm always being asked about creationism when it's actually a subject I don't care much about, to me. And yet, at the same time, it's like, I know creationists aren't idiots. I just don't relate to where they're coming from at all. I'm almost done. Why is this necessary? Why is this fight so important? Why am I always having to answer for it? So I'm conflicted about it. And a few times I've been rude, maybe more than I should be, but not in a very Christian way. But at the same time, now that I've wound up with all that, I just told you I had friends who are creationists, and I would never throw them under the bus or treat them like garbage. And so now, with all that said, and that, just to give my perspective, Mike Lewis is Todd Lewis's dad. Todd Lewis runs the Praise of Folly YouTube channel. Please go check it out, subscribe, give him a like, all that good stuff. Todd's dad is a physicist, a professional working physicist. He's in corporate America. I'm not going to give out more information unless he wants to give out more, but he's working a good corporate gig on technology that I believe, Mike, you had a patent on, or some patents on, something like that?
That's correct. I discovered it, and it's a product that's sold today. It's been sold since about 1997.
Okay, well, I'll ask you a little bit more about that. And by the way, everybody, that's Mike. We'll be doing most of the talking with Mike, but Todd's also here. Say hi, Todd.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Max.
Hey, all right, guys. So I guess I want to hear first from you, Mike, if it's okay. Do we want to talk about the negative? Explain what kind of creationist you are, and what do we fit you within the young Earth creationist crowd, the old Earth creationist crowd? Where are you on all that?
Right. Well, just real briefly, as far as my education, I received my doctorate in 1987 at a major university. It still has
in what kind of physics?
It was condensed matter physics.
Okay.
And anyhow, with respect to creationism, I have always been, all through my education, a creationist. Okay. And I still, as a professional scientist, I'm a director of a research laboratory. We do basic research, and I mean, it's not so much applied as we're trying to understand fundamental electrochemical processes. And the laboratory I direct, we've got several doctorates in electrochemistry. Myself and the lab is equipped as well as any lab, say at Penn State or UC Berkeley or anything like that. And so it's a real research effort for a real corporation. It's the real deal. And so I'm still a young Earth creationist, and primarily there's several reasons why. The scientific evidence does not support either cosmological evolution or biological evolution. The evidence is simply not in favor of the science. Secondly, I'm a creationist because the minute you do away with the creation narrative and make it a myth as opposed to reality, as Christians, it's really difficult to know what to make out of the first 11 chapters of Genesis, and also there's a complete collapse of a moral basis for life. Especially with respect to Christ. What is it that Christ is about? I mean, if there was, everything evolved and so forth, what does that mean for a Christian? What about what does this Adam and Eve and original sin have to do with anything? And hence, what in the world does Jesus have to do anything? And then lastly, if everything is just an accident, due to materialistic determinism, based on the evolutionary model, we are just pieces of meat, and there is no right and there is no wrong. And it's just, as Nietzsche said, the will to power. And whoever can get the power can decide which way they want to direct evolution. and it's not good and it's not bad. It's just the exercise of power, and that's all you've got. There is no moral high ground. There is no moral superiority. There's just power, and that doesn't work. And humans know it. Even the atheist knows that. He still has. Every atheist will become morally outraged at something, if only to be outraged at the Christian who believes in young Earth creationism. They think it's terrible and it's wrong and it leads people down a wrong road. And you can hear all the moral arguments, but they're meaningless within the context of materialistic determinism. And that world simply doesn't work. We're living in it now. It's the law of the jungle.
Well, it's interesting because I really did not come here to debate creationism per se, just to give my perspective. And so it's fascinating listening to you, like, wow, he just said a bunch of things I really agree with and some I simply don't relate to. And that actually should, I think, be okay. I mean, you're taking a very strong position, and I'm, maybe you could call me a moderate, right? Because I'm one of those guys who's like, well, when I look at it, and from my layman's view, and it may well be that it's because I was taught evolution as a child, and it may well be that, again, I just gave you my father's influence, even though we weren't super serious in our religion, so I guess you can take that with any grain you want, but I mean, he was super serious, but he would sit at home and watch televangelists, so it wasn't exactly the best in my view. But sure. In any case, I literally never related to it, and I actually found it alienating because and since becoming much more serious about my faith, I'm not, again, giving necessarily Catholic teaching. The Catholic position is a lot more nuanced than people think it is. I can think of other ways to interpret the Genesis account, and from talking to others and doing my own studies, it appears to me that for thousands of years there have been some pretty serious Christians and even some Jews before Christ who didn't think you should read Genesis all that literally and had different takes on it. So my biggest objection to your phrasing is that like somehow if you're wrong in your take on Genesis, the Bible falls apart. And I can think of a bunch of ways to reconcile it, including, I mean, I've heard so many creative interpretations, I guess, that don't strike me as spiritually unsound. So at the same time, straight up, I'm not here to argue with you. You have your position. You've made it, and we are in agreement on about 80% of that. And I'll even concede to you that I may be the totally wrong one, and you may be dead right, because I'm not infallible, unlike the atheists you just mentioned. Because there is something really hideously ideological about most atheists. Not all, but most. Because even when I was an atheist, I'm just giving you the gospel truth. I was never angry about it, and I would always tell the creationists, well, you may be right. I mean, I don't think you are, but you may be right. That wasn't hard for me as an atheist. And when I see the religious fervor of the atheists, I'm repelled by it, right? Like you somehow, sir, have the most dangerous idea in the world because you think the earth is 6,000 years old, or whatever other figure works for you, let me know. This makes you the most dangerous person on the planet, right? I mean, you need to be silenced, right?
Well, Max, if
you should lose your job. There's people who talk like that, and what?
Well, Max, if I may interject here, they're right. It is an extremely dangerous idea, and it has tremendous impact. You see, if all we have is materialistic determinism, there is no meaning to life.
Well, we agree there.
There's no meaning, and so, as I pointed out, all there is the will to power. That's how you adjudicate, difficulties, because God has not spoken. It's materialistic determinism. Furthermore, I can live my life any way I want, at any level of debauchery, or as good as I possibly can be, and it's still meaningless. But more importantly, I can live any kind of debauched life, and there's no consequences at all.
Well,
At all. And so, as Aldous Huxley pointed out in Ends and Means, he said the biggest reason that he and others adopted, not all, but others adopted the evolution, is because they could live a sexually immoral life.
I tell you,
I mean, there's true. What's at stake as far as morality and standing in judgment before God, if materialistic determinism is correct and it's undirected? There's a tremendous amount at stake, and I am a tremendous threat if, in fact, I'm right. And now, one of the things I must say as well is that theistic evolution it doesn't work. It's much of a joke as far from my perspective, and it's just silliness. Trying to read, you're going to have to allegorize the whole thing, the first 11 chapters of Genesis. And when you do that, you have real trouble with the fall. And if you have trouble with the fall, you've got a lot of trouble with with why in the world did we need Jesus?
I fully believe the fall happened, and I'm still, and I'm fully convinced Adam and Eve happened. And I personally can find zero reason to it does seem like your faith is hinging on you being correct here, but I'm very much against materialism. I recognize that scientific naturalism is a religion. Materialism is a joke and doesn't even make sense. But as far as the mechanisms by which we got here, there's so little we know. I just don't have trouble personally reconciling, say, a 14 billion year universe and the Earth taking a certain amount of time to form a certain way before we got here, because God's fully in charge of time, all the time and space. I do think there was a special moment of creation where we became human and not just animals. But I can give you variant readings, and I don't feel compelled to defend any one of them. To say, for example, the stepping out of the Garden of Eden was stepping into this earth. That's one read. I've read, several others. To me, it just doesn't. Really, materialism is awful, and I guess being steeped too much in evolutionary theory might narrow your mind toward materialism. I could see that, but I have no trouble even believing potentially, the Garden of Eden was what we stepped out of, and this earth was what we stepped into, kind of way of looking at it. And there's other ways. So again, to me, you seem to think you can't. We're so on the same side, except I think you're hyper focused on one thing, and what? I still may be the wrong one. And that's the thing that I can't stand when dealing with the current culture, because from where I stand, even when I was an atheist, I guess I was different than so many of them, but holy cow, it's like I would never see you as an existential threat. I would just be like, he's somebody with an idea I don't agree with. But I guess they do feel that threatened with you, because maybe that's it, because they are materialists, and materialism is so much easier to fit in with evolution. I'll give you that. It's easier to maintain the idea that we strictly evolved from ape-like creatures back over millions of years. It is much easier. But the way I tend to look at it is the appearance of Homo sapiens is where, and whatever. You're so dangerous to them because you just think different.
It's primarily because I have people like me have this commitment that God has spoken. And if I may help clarify some of this, as a scientist, I look at the evolutionary explanations, and I understand cosmological evolution, stellar evolution. I don't do that for a living, but I understand it. I understand, Einstein's general theory of relativity at some level. It's a system of partial differential equations where you assume initial and boundary conditions and so forth, and you see what happens. And it looks like an expanding universe from a singularity would fit the model. The problem is that the Big Bang in particular still cannot explain an enormous amount of things. It's got and even biological evolution is far, far worse. And you have the concept of, with biological evolution, with the discovery of DNA, information. DNA is information.
I know, it's a lot of it too.
I made a living. I have many patents in the field of digital communications, which is based on information theory and the work of several guys that really worked that out. And I've directed.
I think you mean Shannon, right, Dad?
Pardon me, Shannon. Yeah, I've directed postgraduate theses in the field and so forth. So I know communications and information theory extremely well. And one of the things that's true with information is there is a sender. There's no information ever without a sender.
Oh yeah. No question.
And biological information is information, and it's enormous and it's incredibly complex. And there was a sender. Yeah. And so to say that things just evolved. The other thing is that the work that's been done by computational evolutionary biologists who simulate different evolutionary models, is they've shown that the genomes decay. They don't become more complex. Furthermore, there is no physical process that humans know that takes information at one level, runs it through a physical process, and you get more information, which is what is claimed to happen with evolution. You get this higher order of beings or entities as evolution progresses. That's not what they're showing in their simulations and their data. It shows that a genome decays over time.
Actually, I'm going to back you up in a whole lot of what you're saying. Now, my shortcut, and maybe you'll call it a logical shortcut, is that God is who's controlling the laws of physics and probability, so he gets to do things any way he wants to do them, right? But at the same time, you're identifying problems in evolutionary theory that are real. And again, I'll even note that even when I was an atheist, I noticed that there was something intensely ideological especially in like academic atheists, like, we're not supposed to talk about these logical flaws because evolution's a settled matter. And I was like, what? No, there really are problems. Everything you just said is correct. In fact, the reigning paradigm in evolution has been something called neo-Darwinism. And even evolutionary biologists and molecular biologists who believe in evolutionary are now finally discarding it, because it's like, yeah, there's real problems up and down. Now, there's reason to think DNA is overrated and that there's other factors at play, but that's something that neo-Darwinists don't even want to talk about because it's like a religion to them. No, it's more than a religion. It's a fanatical, cultish, like, I've seen it, that you literally can't question the dogma. In fact, one of the reasons I left atheism, believe it or not, was that, and I was leaving atheism, I certainly gave up my atheism, was encounters with atheists, because I was an atheist, and I said, man, you guys are just so obsessed with these creationists. Why don't you leave them alone? Right? Kind of the liberal, what you'd think of as the liberal attitude, like, can't they just be wrong? Why are you got to be so up in arms about it? And they practically lynched me, right? It had very negative, it was psychologically and career-wise was difficult. And I'm like, and I was being called a creationist and a flat earther and all those other things they say. And I'm like, all I said was, this isn't that serious a matter. Now, and this wants me to get to your experience. You were mentioning this to me before we started, and I do want to mention it because I'm like I said, I'm expressing reservations, although we disagree on more than what might seem. I find it unacceptable when people face professional and career repercussions, even in academia, simply for holding your view. Because liberal academia, the idea of a liberal education, if it has any meaning at all, means you get exposed to separate ideas. Now, you were saying, and I'd like you to tell me more about the story. I want people to hear it. You're a creationist and you've made your claim. On the other hand, you are a physicist. You are not a biologist. You are not going into a biology classroom trying to start a fight, right? You are a physicist.
Right.
So there should be no politics here. Were you doing any work to like challenge the Big Bang Theory academically or anything?
No, as far as my teaching load, I taught classical electrodynamics, introductory physics, thermodynamics, the standard physics. There, and it's in a typical physics curriculum. You don't.
Okay, so and just to cut it short, and then I'm going to ask you to expand. But to cut you there. So the point is, fine, you're a creationist. You were also already established as a postdoc, PhD level physicist, teaching things like electrodynamics and straight up freshman physics stuff, which shouldn't have a thing to do with it. And so you were working as a professor teaching that, and what happened?
Well, after I'd been there several years, a professor emeritus, a professor who had retired in the department, was still involved though, came to me and told me that two of the faculty who were atheists were regularly going around the department and talking to all the faculty, seeking to have me denied tenure because I was a Christian, and in particular because I was a creationist. And that was based on one conversation I had with one of the atheists regarding an article he had in the Birmingham News talking about the death of the dinosaurs by a meteor. And it just came out in the conversation. He asked me what I was, and I says, well, I'm a young earth creationist. And he said, no fooling. I said, no fooling. And that was the end of the conversation. I never had another conversation with either of them with regard to that. Other faculty members in the department with regard to evolution.
I want to pretend that I'm gobsmacked, and I want to pretend that I'm shocked. But long experience has taught me not to be shocked, that this is typical. Absolutely. It was 1990. It was 1991. Okay. And that was then. And people tend to doubt that there is such a thing as a cultural Marxist takeover of the universities. But clearly there is one. Now, I don't know that any of the people, that the guy you interacted with or the guys you interacted were necessarily part of that. And I'm just going to tell you something that's interesting. I've looked into research on atheism, and I'm really pretty sure I kind of fell into this subset. There really is clinically a high overlap between autism and atheism. And
really?
There truly is clinically, and I'll give you some studies on it later on if you ask for them. Yes, there's quite a few. I mean, natural atheism does appear in some 2 to 3% of the population, and in autistics, it's something wild like 20 or 30%. And I truly believe, based on a lot of personal experience and observation, that's because the autistic mind and certain other types of minds, because I'm not autistic, but I have leanings that way, is that it's super easy for the autistic type mind to become hyper-focused and snap right into materialism, especially if you're in some field like engineering, heavy math, heavy engineering, heavy working with stuff. It's easy for your mind to get trapped in that, which is pretty sure where I was, because honest to God, I literally was befuddled by the God stuff. I literally looked at, why would you believe any of this? And personally, I just couldn't get the answer I needed. I wasn't in some kind of deep denial. But I think an awful lot of atheists are, because when my mind snapped out of materialism, and I realized materialism is total nonsense, it felt like a belt came off my brain almost, like, oh, I can think now. It was just that sudden, and it wasn't like I suddenly found God in that, but it was more like my openness to it happened because I snapped out of materialism. It's like a spell I was under or something.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of atheist exists because I was that, and I knew guys like that. And with help, they can overcome it. Because really, when your brain is stuck in materialism, like the idea of a God seems like a little weird.
Yeah.
Like you're looking for something right there, son. What are you? It's just what it looks like if your brain is caught in it. I've had a lot of success actually helping people overcome atheism just by talking and pointing out how dumb materialism itself is.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where was I going with all that? Oh, go ahead. We're just talking.
If I may, to emphasize once again how important evolution is to materialistic determinism, and hence evolution is for the atheist, and how threatened they are by any position that questions the validity of evolution, either cosmological or biological, is that prior to the concept of evolution, it was reasonable. It was not reasonable to be an atheist. There was no foundation on which to build atheism. And you looked at the universe, it looked like it was designed. It looked like there was a God. That was really the only explanation. With evolution, you have the person is now reasonable to be an atheist because there's no reason to believe that there's a God. It all happened by accident. Come on, this is the problem. And because there's no God, look, I'm not answerable to anything, to anyone. I can do anything I want. And
I know that. And there's countless examples. There's countless examples.
Exactly. And that is really appealing to a vast majority of people. There's no one to answer to. And that's any time that the thing that gives them some level of legitimacy is threatened, they get really hacked off, because you're talking about them necessarily having to change the way they live because there is God. And the people really get hacked off about that. So there's a tremendous amount at stake if evolution is not true. And like I said, getting back this whole thing, when I look at evolution, either cosmological or biological, I don't see any scientific evidence for it. I see a lot of theories that are plausible theories, but I don't see anything that's certain in any point in any way. And the question of origins, historical issue. It's not scientific because you can't do science on origins. It's not possible.
We agree there. Hey, Todd wanted to speak up and say something. Yeah. I'd like to hear what Todd has to say.
Todd.
Yeah, there was a couple of points. What happened to Dad, and they're attempting to deny him tenure. This kind of dodgy stuff happens all the time. The atheist philosopher of science, Michael Ruse, wrote an article in 2004 on Metanexus, where he talks about how Raymond Damadian, the Armenian Protestant young Earth creationist who helped develop the MRI scanners, was denied tenure. Not tenure, it was denied the Nobel Prize. And Ruse speculates that it was because he was a young Earth creationist. That's what the Damadian's reason for believing he was denied the prize was. And Ruse agrees. He says he probably was denied for that. And he thinks that, even he admits it was a terrible, horrible thing to do. And then you also mentioned, Max, earlier, that the cultural Marxist agenda is powerful. I think it's very important to point out is the SJWs and these Marxist types. The atheists were the first types of people like that in like the 1970s and 80s. Even in the 60s, you had that lunatic Mary Madeline O'Hare. I mean, these were the original SJWs.
Oh yeah, you get no argument from me in that whatsoever. It is something I have slowly unwound, Now, I know a Catholic talking to an Anabaptist is always a dicey proposition, but without arguing, I'm just going to, just because there is much misinformation on this, I can give you what the official Catholic Church position is on evolution, which is that it is acceptable to believe it. It is also not acceptable to treat it like a dogma. And that's it. That's the entire church position for whatever a group church position is, which personally I find eminently reasonable. And I will give testimony that at least me coming in, hearing that was way easier than hearing, I mean, it would have been harder to get me in and interested in Christianity if I was told I had to accept that literal Genesis. So I'm just giving you my personal testimony. It was helpful to me to say, okay, I don't have to give up everything I think I know to begin to walk the path of the Lord and learn more. And so, you know, and I have had interesting conversations, just so you know, with biochemists, and I had a lovely astrophysicist I've spoken to. You know, she believes in the 14 billion year old Earth. She's got a very interesting way that she's with another physicist where they think the Genesis account does match if you read it right. And to me, the kind of, I think my point of that is, to me, as a science nerd growing up, because I was a science nerd, not a scientist, but I love science and science nerds. The science as I understood it was always open to questions. And what definitely happened with evolution, especially neo-Darwinism, is they've closed all questions. They've done this in other areas of science too. They simply close the question. In other words, they are the typical dogmatists that they accuse other people of being. Because really, what is so threatening? And I think you do have your finger on it. Because while I'm not convinced you have to just ditch all of evolutionary theory and all that other stuff to be truly walking with Christ, but not dogma to me is my point. It's not a required belief either way. You may be totally right, and I may be the idiot, right? I could just say that, and I could say it when I was an atheist. But it seems like the evolution, especially the Darwinist survival of the fittest model, which even, by the way, a lot of biologists will openly admit, survival of the fittest and random mutation, that can't explain everything we see. There's biologists who will openly admit it, but there's others who will only admit it in private because they'll be pilloried if they admit it otherwise. It's like it's become this dogma you may not question, and it even reaches out to you beyond any field where it should even matter. And I think it is because the cultural Marxists need to believe this survival of the fittest narrative, and that we're just animals narratives. I think you're dead on right that that's why they're so attached to it. Whereas to me, it was always just an idea.
You know, Max, one of the things I want to clarify, as far as, the extent to which a person calling themselves a Christian needs to adhere to it. I believe that there are people who have confessed Jesus as Lord and live according to his commandments, and who have a problem with young Earth creationism, and I believe that they'll make it. I do believe, however, that they have built a theological foundation that's a bit more shaky than it ought to be. But like I said, I believe that that they can actually enter the kingdom of heaven, believing that. But getting back to it, I, as a scientist, I see that even with say cosmological evolution, you've got this theory which
when you speak of cosmological evolution, you mean the Big Bang and the slow evolution of the universe since then. Okay, just making sure people know.
So basically, you start off with Einstein's general theory of relativity, and you look at the data that you've got from physical observations of the universe, and you say, okay, what kind of initial conditions and boundary conditions do I have to apply to this system of equations? And that's what you have to do. You got to come up with initial conditions and boundary conditions to solve it's a multi-dimensional partial differential equation. But you have to come up with these initial conditions and boundary conditions at t = 0. And these are assumptions. These are not proofs. And what you're doing is coming up with these assumptions on initial and boundary conditions that let you solve the equation and hopefully get a solution that's more or less predictive of what you see today. And of course, the initial conditions and the boundary conditions are conditions that you assume to be correct and true at minus 19 billion years. Now, no one was there. There's no way to do science on this. So is it correct? You see, there's an epistemological standard that they can't meet. It's a surmise. It's, well, you know, if we make these initial conditions and boundary conditions, we can get a solution to Einstein's general theory of relativity equations that, you know, more or less looks like what we see today. But that's not proof. That isn't proof that it happened that way. And the fact is, even if we had a cosmological theory that explained everything that we see in the universe,
it still wouldn't.
Everything. How close would we be to the truth?
Hardly.
We still would not know how it happened.
But Dad,
no
bring
one
up
was there.
Or for that matter, why does it keep happening, and why doesn't it all? Why do those laws of physics keep doing that? Why do the laws of probability not? Why does everything not just dissolve randomly and change at random? Why does physics work at all? Why does it keep happening? That's how I see it. Why does it even keep happening?
What? Yeah.
Dad, I'd like to say something. Why don't you bring up that discussion you had with your professor on astronomy? Not your professor, your advisor. Remember, Dad? About you said the point you made about how long we were looking at the stars, and do we really know what's going on out there?
Oh, yeah. It was the faculty. It was the professor emeritus who came to me and told me about the fellas that were seeking to have me denied tenure. And he commented, and I says, "Look, I can teach physics just fine. I mean, what does evolution have to do with classical electrodynamics or nonlinear optics?" I was doing research in nonlinear optics. I said, "What in the world does it have to do with thermodynamics?" I said, "I can teach these courses just fine. Origins don't bear on any of these things." And he said, "Well, yeah." He says, "But how would you teach cosmology? How would you teach stellar evolution?" And I said, "Look," I said, "how long have we been looking at the stars, scientifically?" I said, what, 100 years? And I said, now backing up a little bit further, we know that stars can explode because the Chinese in the world, there's records of a supernova. And I said, we know that stars explode. But I said, do we really know? Do we know what happens to stars over billions of years? No, we don't know. What we have is stars that look different. Some are giant red stars. We have neutron stars. We've got white dwarfs. We got all kinds of stars, and within the context of of physics that we know, we say, gravitational physics and Einstein's physics and nuclear physics. Well, we can postulate that within the laws that we know, that the stars probably evolved this way. Well, okay, maybe, but is it true?
And they'll assert it. Yeah, if you talk to my
because they're making predictions. They're making predictions of what happens over billions of years. Now, if anybody believes that that's actually true, the theories about stellar evolution, that actually, look, I've got some land in the Okeechobee Swamp in Florida that I'd like to sell you.
Well, I'll tell you, I'll hit you with something that I like to run past physicists, because I'm trying to light a little fire here on this one of these days, because there's a project only physicists are going to be able to do, I think, or maybe some clever engineers. There is, it turns out, I have from a reputable source, there is in fact significant evidence that the speed of light is not as constant as people make it out to be, and that it actually fluctuates over time. Yep. Which would, if that is true, messes with an awful lot of astrophysics, doesn't it?
Oh boy, oh boy.
And I mean, they might be able to work it out, because it might all average out more or less the same, but there is evidence of that. And I got that from a guy named Rupert Sheldrake, who said, yeah, he had investigated it and they had measured it several times over a period of decades, and we're measuring it every decade, and every decade we're coming up with different results. and they just assumed errors and averaged it all out. Eventually, in the 70s, they just kind of standardized it, and so it would just be set and fixed. And they affixed time units to wavelengths of light, so even if the speed of light were varying, you wouldn't know it.
Yeah.
And they did that in the 70s, and that's just kind of the standard working model people work. He actually wants to get people together to try and really nail down, is it really fluctuating? Can we really mark it all off to measuring errors? I can tell that that's the kind of project that only, like, the same way astronomers are, right? Physicists who want to do it in their spare time. But I keep putting it out there, especially every time I see a physicist. Yeah. Someone ought to do that. Someone ought to really look into it, because there's no money in proving that wrong. But if light's really not a constant, you know, or if it's less of a constant, because there's evidence that big G does that too, that the gravitational constant may in fact fluctuate slightly. And so, well, if it does, shouldn't somebody be figuring out if it's doing so in any sort of predictable way, if it is at all?
No. It's too important that the speed of light is constant at all times over all distances, because we use that with the red shift to estimate how far away galaxies and stars are, and that gives us the distances that are billions of light years and so forth. I mean, so they're not going to touch that. They're not going to touch that, because they got to have billions of years for the for the Big Bang to work.
It's going to take what it's going to take. Yeah, that's right. So it's going to take subversives who actually want to know the answer and doing it on their own time. But I bet you it'd be an interesting project. It really would be.
Absolutely. But you know, one of the things with respect to evolution in general is this, and it has to do with scales of time and length. We humans can interact with things in an unmediated way. In other words, directly, over times that are quite short. You know, the span of a lifetime, and on scales of length that are, you know, pretty small, but not microscopic. We don't deal with those. We can't deal with microscopic sizes unmediated, and we can't deal with extremely large distances unmediated. And so to look at things, you know, so to consider things that were extremely ancient, you know, billions of years in the past, and say billions of years into the future, we have to, our understanding of those, say, events in the billions of years in the past has got to come through the mediation of tremendous telescope observations within the context of an extremely complicated theory. And to say that we absolutely know what's going on is ridiculous. And furthermore,
that's true.
Because it's heavily mediated, there's not a direct experience, because it's simply impossible for humans to have an unmediated, you know, experience of 19 billion years ago. Secondly, with regard to size, let's talk about the quantum mechanical world, and the standard nuclear model is extremely important for the explanation of the early stages of the Big Bang, where quarks and gluons and things like that begin to condense into regular matter, and so that model's extremely important. And with regard to quarks and gluons, it's understood that quarks and gluons cannot be isolated from one another. So it's not possible for us to isolate them. So there's no way to study quarks and gluons. So we have to make this assumption based on the theory, the mathematical equations, that such entities exist, despite the fact that we can't prove that they exist. These are mathematical quantities. And we turn the mathematical crank and we say, well, you know, at t equals 10 to the minus 40 seconds, you know, we began to get these condensations of these higher order entities into neutrons, electrons, mesons, pi mesons, and so forth, and that then condensed into electrons and protons and neutrons, and now we get condensation into helium, and then helium began to coalesce and things like that. But the thing is, though, all these things are these things, well, some of them we can't, everybody agrees we can't ever detect, but even things like electrons and protons, we can't deal with them directly. I can only deal with them through theories that predict what these things might do, but I can't, I'm mediated. I detect electrons through instrumentation.
Yeah, exactly. And none of this tells you how to live your life. None of this tells you what your purpose is. None of it tells you what's right and wrong. None of it does any of that. It's interesting, too, that you're the person that I would think a young person studying science who wanted to be a real scientist should be listening to. Because the truth of the matter is, we often speak of science as settled, and once we've decided it's settled, we're no longer allowed to ask questions, and that's supposed to be the very antithesis of science. There are assumptions underlying current, not multiple fields of science. I mean, probably every field. I'm sorry, every field of science. But there are multiple assumptions running through physics that are still ultimately just assumptions.
Oh, absolutely.
And there's still multiple assumptions in biology that are simply working assumptions that sort of seem to work. And if you never allow yourself to think the current paradigm is broken or the current models don't really make sense, if you don't allow yourself to do that, how the hell are you going to innovate anything or come up with any new idea? Even from a strict scientific perspective, this makes no sense. You need the people who are there who are challenging and saying, look, here's all the assumptions you just made to get all the way to trying to predict the behavior of an electron. And there's a boatload of assumptions on every step. It just really is.
That is absolutely true. There's a lot of dark secrets in physics that people don't understand. Statistical mechanics, which is an extremely important field, is built on the ergodic theorem, and it's never been proven. It's just assumed to be true, and you assume it to be true, and you turn the mathematical crank, and you get these equations. And you say, well, I hope they're right. Well, you do a bunch of experiments, and son of a gun, the ergodic theorem is a good assumption, and that was fine, but you can't prove it.
Right, and you should be always admitting that you can't prove it if you're thinking like a real scientist, because there may be a better explanation.
Exactly.
Hey, listen, we've hit the 45-minute mark.
Okay.
And we have a couple of commenters I'd like to get in, and then we'll wrap up, okay? Sure. We have a couple comments here. Adam Smith comments. He says, intelligent design becomes more credible as the fine-tuning of life in the universe becomes more and more apparent. Luke Barnes is good. A fortunate universe. Dark matter and energy seems like a total fudge. Maybe dark matter is God. Laughing out loud. Yeah, you know what? I'm strictly looking at this from a scientific, from a science nerd's perspective, from the philosophy of science perspective. All these kinds of questions should be on the table at all times.
Yes.
If they just should be. Or just an acknowledgement. And instead what we see, and it does track with ideological atheism. I see it, right? Because, you know, this may blow your mind, but I've met Hindus working in the sciences who can't stand atheists because, like, they're bullies and get in the way of free thought and inquiry. You know, philosophical theists who are not Christian have complained about this to me.
Deepak Chopra a big one.
Really? I'm not even a fan of the man. I don't, although I don't know his work deeply. I know there's some weird stuff he's into that I'm not, but whatever. He probably has complained about it. I would imagine he would, because this materialist atheism is a dogmatic religion. And I keep trying to tell people that it is. It's a dogmatic religion. It's like a cult you join. You sign on. You don't just sign on to believe evolution. Let me make this as my closing point on evolution. You don't just sign on to believe in evolution. You sign on to believe that evolution happens in exactly the way they told you exactly all the time, and you're a dangerous lunatic if you question it. Ditto the Big Bang Theory, which a Christian came up with in the first place, but never mind. Anybody questions that Big Bang Theory must be an existential threat to civilization.
Yep.
And that's deranged, okay? That's people need to know that should be instantly identifiable as wrong. Like, we're not allowed What's going to happen? The baby science will die because you question the Big Bang Theory. The mighty science gods will smite us if you question evolution, and no one will be able to repair their cars or do medicine anymore. Right?
Right. That is such garbage. You can't do science and be a creationist. That is the biggest lie.
Of course it is. Of course it is. I mean, I really think that the world needs to get back to studying ideas like teleology, Aristotle, metaphysics.
Yes.
What they're calling a science education now is rote memorization of a lot of things you're supposed to know.
And indoctrination.
You can put it back out, and it is indoctrination. And I don't know how people can't see it at this point. Now, one of the reasons I stopped being an atheist is because I observed the behavior, and I'm like, these people are kind of nuts. I really did think that, and that's kind of what tipped me into where I am now. And I actually think atheism truly is one of the most evil things on the planet, especially as far as the culture goes, not to mention the individual, but holy cow. Okay, listen, you want to make any closing remarks, Mike?
Oh, I just to emphasize the comment of that one fellow that intelligent design, which I alluded to earlier, is really vital in this issue of information. I think information, its existence, is one of the greatest threats to the whole concept of biological evolution. And the other thing that I want to mention with respect to physics and so this desire to have the theory of everything, which is really bound up with cosmological evolutions, is that some very significant theorists that have been working in string theory and membrane theory. One of the fellows wrote a book, Not Even Wrong, and it's just, he says it's just a waste of time. We're not making any progress, and it is the premier study of physics today. And it's at a real crisis. There's just no progress in it, really. And then secondly, with regard to physics, the distinction between ontological knowledge and operational knowledge. And I remember a conversation that a friend of mine had with Freeman Dyson. Freeman Dyson is a giant in quantum theory and nuclear theory. And basically some contributions he made to quantum field theory. And my friend called him up and was talking to Freeman Dyson about some stuff, Young's double slit experiment and information travel and speed of light travel. And Freeman Dyson said, I'm completely disinterested in this stuff. What we have is operational knowledge. We have no idea what is actually there underneath it all. We do not possess ontological information. It's just operational. And Dyson said, I'm completely disinterested in ontological things because we don't know what's there. All we know is how to kick the universe and how it kicks back. And that's it. And that's operational knowledge. So, from a philosophy of science standpoint, physics knows very little about the universe.
I will tell you one thing, and we're going to close here, but I will tell you one thing that you may take heart on. I mean, we talk to a lot of people, we get messages from a lot of people, and I've heard from a number of young people, young men primarily, but young women too, studying science and just agog at how stupid scientific naturalism actually is. Just how dumb materialism is and how dumb scientific naturalism, which means because one thing we'll agree on, I will agree that a hyper focus on evolution is very important to secular moderns. Like, it's the most important dogmatic thing in the world you should believe. That hyper focus, and in general the culture pushes materialism on people. I don't just mean economic materialism. In fact, what I would say is that they push scientific materialism, of which I will admit evolutionary theory is a big player in that. But it's not just the evolutionary theory. It's in everything. It's on all of the assumptions of what is good and bad. It's in all of our economic models of what counts as economic progress versus not economic progress. Everybody's been reduced to thinking that way. Even of thinking of children as a burden and a responsibility and not a joy and something, the whole culture's mired in that. And I see it because this may even be where some of my resistance to creationism comes. I was taught evolution, and it made perfect sense to me as a child. And I'm not the only one that's happened to. A friend of mine, Mike, who's a real smart science guy, said he got beat up for believing in evolution in church when he was a child. It was kid stuff, right? But it scarred him, and it took him a while. What bothers me ultimately is there's so much fight over this, and it's so intensely ideological. And I honestly think it's the atheist side that is much, much more ideological about it. And I do think and I think it's worth, if you're still an atheist, or even if you're just a young mind, curious, to start noticing that even in science, the science that atheists talk about all the time as if they are science experts, you're allowed to be skeptical of them and look at what they're saying and say, does that actually make sense? And can you prove that to me? And to dig into any claim they're making, that's actually the science. I love scientists like Richard Feynman, who wasn't a religious man, but he was open and exploratory and ready to admit he was wrong and ready to be challenged on any point. And to be totally wrong and discover something new that's even better. That's what he loved about science. And what is science today? It's like, memorize this and believe it. And it's nonsense. It's nonsense. Even if you're not a liberal, even if you don't believe in classical liberalism anymore, I'm not sure I do, but even if you're just a classical liberal, you should be going, yes, we should be free to explore all these ideas. Right? That's supposed to be the liberal idea, the classical liberal idea. I know young people are figuring it out on their own because I hear from them. Mm-hmm. And I know, and I'm hearing from a growing number of working scientists who are now like in their 40s and 50s and have been surrounded by this stuff. We're starting to push back and say, hey, scientific naturalism doesn't even make sense. Because by the way, it doesn't. And you don't have to be religious at all to notice that. You don't have you don't have to be religious at all to notice that materialism is nonsense too. Once you know what it is, but most people don't even know what it is. They've been indoctrinated in it and they don't know it. But they're coming out of it anyway. All right. Hey, Todd, did you have any closing thoughts?
Yeah. I was just going to say, I think your friend Inspiring Philosophy, and then yourself as well, I think part of why some creationists are so militant is they get it all the time from the atheists, and it sort of radicalizes them.
And you know what? I believe that's on purpose. I honestly believe that cultural Marxists, actually there's reason to believe this going all the way back to the Scopes monkey trial. There's reasons to believe the cultural Marxists started this fight because they like this fight. If you look at Saul Alinsky's rules for radicals, one of them is to pick a target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. Basically pick a wedge issue that polarizes people and force them to take a position. And just by doing that, they legitimize the atheists, and they also created an impression that, I mean, like, even if you're a creation scientist and a young earth creationist at that, I would assume, think, well, it's still acceptable to question anything we're currently seeing in science. If you've got evidence that what we're seeing is wrong, it's fair game. That's what you should be saying to anybody. And it's like they've intentionally polarized it. Like they want it to be a fight to the death. Yeah. And I don't believe that ever really came up on the creationist side. I think that was more like on the creationist side, it was more like in reaction against this really forceful and malevolent push to make it, you know, Darwinian evolution the center of biology. And even there, when I was a kid and not particularly religious, I'm like, I don't even see, you know, Darwin was interesting as heck to me, and I was a kid and I was into dinosaurs and all that stuff, right? But even then, I say, you're working as a biologist looking at cellular life. What was happening 150 million years ago is not relevant to what I'm doing now. So I got off topic, but let me just say again, everybody remember what open-mindedness really means. And really, if you're going to go into science, find a field, hopefully, that's still open where you're allowed to ask fundamental questions, because that seems to have gone away in a lot of our educational institutions. And I'm sure all three of us would agree to that.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, everybody. Well, please give us a like. Please give us a subscribe. Please find us on escapingatheism.com. And God bless everybody.
All right.